On the coldest Christmas Eve of 1886, a dying rancher opened his door to a woman covered in ice, half dead, clutching a blood-stained leather bag she refused to let go of. She said she was his mail-order bride. He never even remembered writing the letter. But here's what Caleb Hartman didn't know. Eleanor Shaw had walked 18 miles through a killing blizzard, not because she loved him, but because she was running from something far more dangerous than any storm. A powerful man wanted her silenced. A Pinkerton detective was tracking her face across every post office in Wyoming, and hidden inside her trunk, sewn into a false bottom, was a journal that could free an innocent man from prison or get her killed. His cattle were dying, his land was being stolen, and the one woman who could save everything he had left was carrying a secret that could destroy them both. You're listening to Wild West Stories channel, your home for tales of rugged cowboys, fierce frontier love, and the untamed spirit of the American West. If the dust, the danger, and the heartbeat of the open plains call to you, saddle up. You're riding with us now. This story teaches us that the courage to trust again, even when trust has broken you before, is the bravest thing a person can do. And sometimes, the people we never expected are the ones who save us from ourselves. If this story touched your heart, drop a like and tell me in the comments. Would you have opened that door? Share this with someone who believes in second chances. And if you're new here, hit subscribe and ring that bell so you never miss another story from the wild frontier.
The first bullet came through the cabin window in October. By Christmas Eve, Caleb Hartman was hoping the next one would aim better. He was dragging a dead cow through knee-deep snow when the thought crossed his mind, casual as a man noting the weather. The heifer had dropped some time before dawn, her body already stiffening in the cold by the time he found her. She was his 6th loss this month. Her eyes were still open, clouded over and accusing, and Caleb did not bother closing them. There was no point in granting dignity to the dead when the living had so little left. His hands were raw inside his gloves, the leather cracked and useless against the Wyoming winter. His breath came in ragged clouds that the wind tore apart before they fully formed. The only warmth he carried was the whiskey bottle tucked inside his coat, half empty, pressing against his ribs like a second heartbeat. He stopped dragging and looked upstream. Through the curtain of falling snow, he could just make out the dark smudge of smoke rising from Drummond's mining operation 5 miles north. The Drummond Mining Company had been working that copper vein since spring, and every month since, Caleb's cattle had gotten sicker. He was not a man given to coincidence. 3 months ago, a fellow named Virgil Crenshaw had ridden up to the cabin with a smile that never touched his eyes, and an offer to buy the land at 1/4 of what it was worth. Caleb had told him where he could put that offer. A week later, a rifle shot punched through his cabin window at 2 in the morning. The slug buried itself in the far wall, 3 feet from where Caleb had been sleeping. The town sheriff investigated, which meant he rode out, looked at the hole, shrugged, and rode back. Caleb left the dead cow where she lay and trudged back to the cabin. He would deal with the carcass tomorrow, or the wolves would deal with it tonight. Either way, it was handled. Inside, the cabin was only slightly warmer than outside. The fire had burned down to coals, and the draft that slipped through every crack in the walls made the single flame of the oil lamp shudder. The table was covered in unopened mail, most of it from the bank. He picked up the latest letter, the one with the red ink along the edge, and read it for the second time. Deadline for payment. March 15th. Amount owed, $200. He had maybe $11 in coin hidden in a coffee tin above the stove. His herd was worth less every day, assuming any of them survived long enough to sell. But it was the last line of the letter that made his stomach turn cold. He had missed it the first time, buried in the small print at the bottom. Please be advised that an interested buyer has expressed intent to acquire the property should foreclosure proceed. Drummond Mining Company. He set the letter down slowly. Not surprise, just confirmation. Drummond was not just trying to buy him out. He was making sure there would be nothing left to refuse. Caleb's eyes drifted to the window, to the small rise behind the cabin, where a lone pine tree stood guard over a simple wooden cross. Margaret's grave. 2 years gone. Typhoid fever, the doctor and Casper had said afterward, could have been treated if she had gotten to him sooner. That was the part that ate at Caleb like acid. She had asked. She had begged him, "Caleb, please, something is wrong. I need the doctor." And his answer, spoken while his hands were busy with a breech calf and his mind was on the dozen other things that needed doing. "Next week, Maggie. After calving. I will take you next week." There was no next week. Margaret was dead 4 days later. Caleb finished the whiskey. It burned going down, but the warmth was a lie, same as everything else. He had chosen the ranch over his wife, and it had cost him everything. Now the ranch was dying too, and he figured that was about right. Penance. The slow, grinding kind that matched the slow, grinding guilt. He was considering whether to feed the fire or let it die when the knock came. 3 sharp raps against the cabin door. Hard enough to cut through the howl of the wind. Caleb's hand went to the rifle above the doorframe automatically. Out here you answered armed, or you did not answer at all. Bears sometimes, wolves rarely, men occasionally, and those were usually the most dangerous. He pulled the door open 6 inches. The wind tried to rip it from his grip, throwing a spray of ice crystals into his face. The woman standing on his porch should not have been alive. She was covered in snow, so much of it that she looked like something the storm had built and abandoned. Her coat was dark wool, too thin for this weather, crusted white at the shoulders and sleeves. Her bonnet was knocked sideways, revealing dark hair plastered to her skull with ice. Her lips were blue. Her face was so pale it was nearly see-through. She was carrying a small trunk in one hand, the knuckles white with cold and effort. In the other hand, clutched against her chest the way a mother holds a child, was a worn leather bag. The strap had a dark stain on it, the rusty brown of old blood. Caleb noticed it the way a soldier notices things, automatically, without deciding to. But her eyes were clear, sharp, and completely undefeated. Caleb Hartman. Her voice cut through the wind like a blade, stronger than it had any right to be. "Who the hell are you? Eleanor Shaw." She shifted her weight, and he saw her knees trembling with the effort of staying upright. "Your bride." For a long moment the words did not register. They were sounds without meaning, like a language he had forgotten. Then memories surfaced through the whiskey fog. 6 months ago. June. He had been in town, drunk and miserable, and he had seen the advertisement tacked to the wall outside the general store. Mail-order brides. Companionship and partnership for the modern frontiersman. Inquire within. He had laughed at it. Then he had stopped laughing. Then, in a moment of desperation so deep it felt like drowning, he had written a letter. He barely remembered what he said. Something about a ranch, about being alone, about not having much to offer. He had described himself honestly. Too honestly, probably. Widowed, struggling, not young anymore. He had sent it and forgotten about it. Assumed nothing would come of it. You. He could not finish the sentence. "I wrote back," Eleanor said. Her teeth were chattering, but her voice held steady. "Twice. You never responded. So I took that as silent acceptance. I have been traveling for 3 weeks. The train got as far as Cheyenne. Then I hired a wagon to Casper. Then I walked the last 18 miles because the driver refused to go further in this weather." "You walked 18 miles. In this, I had no choice." She looked at him directly, and despite the cold, despite the exhaustion carved into every line of her face, there was something unbreakable in that gaze. "I have nowhere else to go, Mr. Hartman. You can turn me out into this storm and let me die, or you can give me 1 night. Tomorrow morning, if you still want me gone, I will go." He should have said no. Should have told her this was a mistake. that he had nothing to offer, that he was a man too broken to be of use to anyone, let alone a woman who deserved better than a failing ranch and a ghost for a husband. But the wind gusted hard and Eleanor swayed, and her hand shot out to grip the door frame to keep from falling. And Caleb saw the way she held that leather bag tighter, pulling it closer even as her legs buckled. Whatever was in that bag mattered more to her than standing upright. She was running from something. He knew it the way he knew weather and terrain and the weight of a loaded rifle. Something in the set of her jaw, the way her eyes kept scanning past him into the cabin as if checking for threats. The old blood on that bag strap. Against every instinct screaming at him to protect the little solitude he had left, Caleb stepped back and opened the door. Eleanor Shaw walked into his cabin like she was walking into her own execution. Head up, shoulders squared, refusing to show weakness even as her body shook with cold. She set the trunk down by the door but kept the leather bag in her hands. And she did not let go of it when she sat down at the table, and she did not let go of it when Caleb pushed a cup of hot water toward her, and she did not let go of it when her eyes finally closed with exhaustion 30 minutes later. Caleb sat in the chair across from her, watching this stranger sleep at his table with a bag of someone else's blood pressed against her heart, and he thought, she is running from something, and whatever it is bad enough to make her walk 18 miles through a killing storm to reach a man she has never met. He should ask. He should demand answers. But tonight he was too tired. And honestly, he was too tired to care. He put another log on the fire, pulled a blanket over the sleeping woman, and sat back down with his rifle across his knees. Outside, the blizzard screamed against the cabin walls. Inside, for the first time in 2 years, Caleb Hartman was not alone. He did not know that the woman who had just crossed his threshold was being hunted by 2 men. One who needed her to speak, and one who needed her silent forever. Eleanor knew the cattle were being poisoned before she had finished buttoning her coat. She had woken before dawn, moving through the cabin in silence, cataloging everything the way Dr. Whitfield had taught her. Observe first. Always observe. The cabin told her a story she had expected but had not been fully prepared for. A man living alone in a structure that was slowly collapsing around him. Roof leaking in 4 places. Food supplies nearly gone. Dust on every surface except the whiskey bottles, of which there were 7, all empty, lined up along the windowsill like sentries. But it was the barn that told the real story. She dressed quickly in the same damp clothes from the night before, wrapped her shawl around her head, and stepped outside into a world scraped clean by the storm. The wind had stopped sometime in the night, and the silence that followed was so complete it felt holy. Snow lay in smooth drifts across the yard, softening every edge, making the failing ranch look almost peaceful. The barn was 60 feet from the cabin. When Eleanor pulled open the heavy door, the smell hit her first. Sickness and waste and the sweet, wrong scent of animals that had stopped fighting. She stood in the doorway and let her eyes adjust to the dim light, and what she saw made her chest tighten. 15 cattle, maybe 16, huddled together in the stalls and along the back wall. Most of them were lying down, too weak or too resigned to stand. Through Dr. Whitfield's eyes, the eyes he had given her through 3 years of relentless teaching, she catalogued the symptoms with clinical precision. Pale mucous membranes, dull rough coats, jaundiced eyes with a yellow tinge that spoke of liver damage, loose stool in the gutters, nasal discharge, weight loss so severe she could count ribs from across the barn, heavy metal toxicity. She had seen this exact presentation twice before. Once in a farming community in rural Virginia where a tannery was dumping waste upstream. Once in Montana where a copper mine had contaminated a creek that ran through grazing land. Both times, Dr. Whitfield had traced the poison to its source, treated the surviving animals, and documented everything in his journal. The journal that was currently hidden in a false bottom she had sewn into her trunk with her own hands, 3 days before she fled Philadelphia. Eleanor moved through the barn slowly, checking each animal. She ran her hands along necks, checked gums, looked at the whites of their eyes. One heifer, a roan-colored animal with a white blaze on her face, lifted her head slightly when Eleanor crouched beside her. The animal's eyes were dull, but not dead. There was still something in there. still fighting. "Hey there, girl," Eleanor murmured. "I know you do not feel well, but we're going to try." The heifer's ear twitched. Eleanor felt a small, fierce pulse of determination rise in her chest. She heard boots crunching through snow behind her. Caleb stood in the barn doorway, backlit by the morning sun, looking rough and suspicious, and not at all happy to see her in his barn. "What are you doing?" "Looking at your cattle." She kept her voice neutral, careful. "They are very sick, Mr. Hartman. I know they are sick. I have been watching them die for 3 months." He stepped inside, arms crossed. "Do not need a stranger to tell me that." Eleanor straightened. She chose her next words like a woman choosing where to step in a minefield. "I have seen something like this before. In a book. The animals have the signs of metal poisoning. Something in their water could be making them sick." The lie tasted sour. Not a book. 3 years of training under one of the finest veterinary minds in Pennsylvania, but she could not say that. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Caleb's jaw tightened. "You have been here 12 hours, and you think you know what is killing my herd. I do not know your ranch. But I know what a dying animal looks like, and your cattle are dying. Where do they drink?" "Creek that runs through the south pasture, same as always. Has anything changed upstream recently? New activity, construction, mining?" The word landed between them like a stone in still water. Caleb's expression shifted. Something dark flickered behind his eyes. "Drummond's mine started operations last spring," he said slowly. "But the water looks fine." "Copper contamination does not always change the look of water," Eleanor said. She was pushing the edge of what a school teacher would reasonably know, but the stakes were too high for caution. It builds up in the animals over time, damages their liver, their blood. They get sick slowly, waste away. By the time you notice something is wrong, the damage is already deep. Caleb stared at her. The silence stretched between them, charged with things neither of them was saying. Then he spoke, and what he said surprised them both. "There is a spring on the north side of the property, underground fed, 3 miles from here. That spring would be clean. Nothing upstream from it but rock and pine trees. No mining, no runoff, nothing. Then we need to move the herd. Today." For the first time, Eleanor saw something flicker across Caleb's face that was not grief or anger or suspicion. It was calculation. The rancher in him. The man who had built this place from raw land and bare hands, stirring under the weight of 2 years of guilt and whiskey. "I know the route," he said. "There is a draw we can use that keeps us out of the worst drifts. But some of these animals cannot walk that far. Then we get the strongest ones moving first. They will help lead the others." Caleb looked at her for a long moment. Then he turned, grabbed 2 halters from the wall, and handed her one. "Let us get to work." What followed was 3 hours of the hardest labor Eleanor had performed since leaving Pennsylvania. Together they coaxed, pulled, and sometimes physically supported animals that had nearly lost the will to live. The roan heifer was the first Eleanor approached. She murmured to the animal, running her hands along the rough coat, checking vitals, encouraging movement. When the heifer finally struggled to her feet, trembling but upright, Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes. Caleb led the way through the snow, and Eleanor understood immediately why he had insisted on going first. He knew this land the way she knew the symptoms of copper poisoning. Every gully, every drift, every rise and hollow. He picked a path through terrain that looked impassable, navigating by landmarks buried under 3 feet of white. She had the medical knowledge, but he had the land knowledge. For the first time they were complementing each other, and both of them felt it even if neither one said a word about it. The Great Die-Up, as history would later call it, was already underway across Wyoming territory, that winter of 1886. The worst blizzards in recorded memory were killing cattle by the hundreds of thousands on the open range. Entire ranching operations that had thrived for a decade were being wiped out in a single season. Caleb's ranch was not just fighting contamination, it was fighting history itself. They lost 1 cow on the way to the spring. The animal went down in a drift halfway there and would not get up. Eleanor tried everything she knew. coaxing, pulling, checking vitals, warming the animal's ears and muzzle with her bare hands. Nothing worked. The cow died in the snow with Eleanor's palm pressed against its neck, and she felt the last slow heartbeat fade to nothing under her fingers. She stood up slowly. Caleb was watching her. She tucked her hands behind her back so he would not see them shaking. "We save the ones we can save," she said. Her voice did not waver. "We keep moving." When they finally reached the spring, clear water bubbling up from underground rock untouched by surface runoff or mining operations, Eleanor let out a breath she had been holding for 3 hours. The cattle drank deeply, and some of them, not all but some, lifted their heads afterward with something approaching awareness. The roan heifer drank longest of all, then looked around at the clean snow and the pine trees and the wide blue sky as if remembering what the world looked like when it was not trying to kill you. 22 cattle had made the walk. 1 had died. The numbers were not good, but they were not zero, and right now not zero was the best Eleanor could hope for. She stood at the edge of the spring and looked upstream, past the trees, toward the dark column of smoke rising from Drummond's mining operation against the winter sky. She felt certainty settle in her bones like the cold. Someone was killing this herd, and she would stake her life it was not an accident. Caleb had not seen the town of Casper go this quiet since the day they hanged a horse thief outside the livery stable in '84. It was the first week of January when he and Eleanor made the trip to town for supplies. The ride in was 7 miles of frozen road and awkward silence, the wagon creaking over ruts that the cold had turned to iron. Eleanor sat beside him on the bench seat with her back straight and her hands folded in her lap, that leather medical bag tucked between her feet where she could feel it against her ankles. She had not let that bag out of arm's reach since the night she arrived. Caleb had noticed. He had noticed a lot of things about Eleanor Shaw in the 10 days since she walked through his door. The way she moved through the barn with the confidence of someone who had done it 1,000 times. The way she examined the cattle not with curiosity but with expertise. Her hands finding pulse points and checking lymph nodes with a sureness that no schoolteacher had any business possessing. The way she sometimes started to say something technical, caught herself, and rephrased it in simpler terms. She was hiding something. That much was obvious. But she was also saving his cattle, and right now that mattered more than whatever secret she carried in that blood-stained bag. Casper, in January, was a hard little town made harder by the cold. Wooden buildings lined the main street like crooked teeth, their facades bleached by sun and wind. Smoke rose from every chimney. Horses stood hip-shot at the hitching rails, blankets thrown over their backs against the chill. The few people moving along the boardwalks were bundled thick and walking fast, heads down, not looking for conversation. But they stopped and looked when Caleb's wagon pulled up in front of Thompson's general store. Martha Henderson was standing outside the boarding house across the street, broom in hand, mouth already open. 2 men Caleb recognized from the saloon were leaning against the post office wall, watching with the studied casualness of people who were very interested and trying hard not to show it. Old Bill Grady and his crew were gathered outside the Three Rivers Saloon, and Caleb could hear the murmur start even before he set the wagon brake. Eleanor stepped down from the wagon without help, which Caleb noted with a mix of irritation and grudging respect. She walked beside him toward the store with her chin up and her eyes forward, and he could tell by the set of her jaw that she heard every whisper and was choosing to ignore them. Thompson, the general store owner, was a grizzled man in his 60s who had been selling goods in Casper since before it was Casper. He measured out flour with deliberate slowness, his eyes moving between Caleb and Eleanor like he was reading a story written in the space between them. "Heard you got yourself a wife," Thompson said. "Mail order, they say. From back east, Philadelphia." "That is right," Caleb said flatly. Thompson looked at Eleanor. "City women do not last long out here, ma'am. No offense." Eleanor met his eyes without flinching. "None taken. I do not plan on being a city woman much longer." Thompson grunted and went back to measuring flour, but Caleb saw the corner of his mouth twitch. Not a smile exactly. more like the acknowledgement that he had been outmaneuvered. They were loading the wagon when it happened. Bill Grady, who had been drinking since breakfast, judging by the way he swayed, stepped off the boardwalk and called out something crude about mail-order brides that made the men around him snicker. Caleb did not hear the exact words. He did not need to. He crossed the street in 3 strides. Grady was a big man, but Caleb had 4 inches on him and 20 years of hard living that had turned his body into rope and leather. He grabbed Grady by the collar with one hand and pulled him close enough that Grady could smell the cold on his skin. "Say that again," Caleb said quietly. His voice was soft, which was worse than shouting, and everyone within earshot knew it. Grady's eyes went wide. The smirk died on his face. He raised both hands, palms out. "Just talking, Hartman. Did not mean anything by it." Caleb held him for 1 more second, then released him. Grady stumbled back, adjusting his collar, trying to recover some dignity. He did not find any. Caleb turned and walked back to the wagon. Eleanor was watching him with an expression he could not quite read. Something had shifted in her eyes, not gratitude exactly, more like recognition, as if she had just seen something underneath the grief and the whiskey that she had not expected to find. It was then that Silas Drummond stepped out of the bank. He was a well-built man in his 50s, dressed better than anyone else in Casper in a dark wool coat and polished boots. His face was clean-shaven, and his hair was silvered at the temples. And he carried himself with the easy confidence of a man who was used to being the most important person in any room he entered. He crossed the street toward them with a smile that was all teeth and no warmth. "Hartman," he said, extending a hand that Caleb did not take. "Good to see you in town. How is the ranch holding up this winter? I hear it has been a hard season for cattle." "We are managing," Caleb said. Drummond's eyes moved to Eleanor, and his gaze lingered a beat too long. Caleb felt the hair on the back of his neck prickle. "And who is this?" "A new addition to the household." "My wife," Caleb said. The word came out before he could think about it, and he felt Eleanor go still beside him. "A new bride." Drummond's smile widened. "Congratulations, Hartman, truly. I hope she finds Wyoming to her liking." He looked at Eleanor again. "Many women do not." "I find it just fine," Eleanor said. Her voice was pleasant, her expression neutral, but Caleb could see the tension in her shoulders. She had felt it too. The thing underneath Drummond's words, the hawk's shadow. Drummond nodded, wished them well, and crossed back toward the bank. As he went, Caleb heard a fragment of conversation through the open window of the bank office, carried on the still, cold air. "Hartman will not survive the winter. When the land goes to auction, you know who to contact." Drummond's voice. Casual. Already certain. As if Caleb's ruin was a matter of bookkeeping, not a man's life falling apart. Caleb's fists clenched at his sides. But he had no proof and no leverage. Not yet. They were halfway home when they found Samuel Porter on the road. Porter was the largest rancher in the area, 45 years old and built like a fence post. Hard, weathered, not given to asking for help or showing weakness. He was leading his best mare by the halter, and even from a distance Caleb could see the animal was in trouble. Her belly was distended, she kept looking back at her flanks, and she was refusing to take more than a few steps at a time. Caleb pulled up the wagon. "Porter, Hartman." Porter's eyes flicked to Eleanor. "Ma'am." "Your mare looks poorly," Caleb said. Porter's jaw tightened. "She has been off for 2 days. Will not eat, will not settle. I was heading to Doc Harlan's, but the old drunk probably will not be sober enough to help." Eleanor was already climbing down from the wagon. "May I take a look?" she said, not asking permission exactly, just giving Porter the courtesy of pretending he had a choice. Porter looked at Caleb, who shrugged. "She knows animals," was all he said. It was the truth, even if he did not yet understand how or why. Eleanor approached the mare slowly, letting the animal see her, letting her smell her hands. Then she began her examination. Her fingers moved along the mare's belly with practiced precision, pressing, palpating, reading the animal's body like a text she had studied for years. She checked the gums, the eyes, the rate of breathing. She put her ear against the mare's flank and listened. "Sand colic," she said after 2 minutes. "See how her belly is distended here, and the way she keeps looking at her flanks. She has ingested sand with her feed, probably from eating hay off bare ground. It is blocking her intestines." Porter frowned. "How do you know that?" Eleanor hesitated. Just a fraction of a second, barely noticeable. But Caleb caught it. "I have read about it," she said, "and I have seen it once before." She opened her leather bag and pulled out a small bottle of mineral oil. She administered it to the mare with hands that moved with unmistakable training, holding the animal's head at exactly the right angle, pouring the oil slowly enough that the horse swallowed rather than aspirated. She gave Porter detailed instructions. "Walk her continuously. Do not let her lie down or roll. If she rolls, she could twist her gut, and then there is nothing anyone can do. Give her another dose of mineral oil in 4 hours. If she has not passed the sand by morning, come find me." Porter took the halter back with a grudging nod. He looked at Eleanor the way a man looks at a card player who has just shown an unexpected hand. "School teacher," he said. "That is right," Eleanor replied. Porter grunted. Must have been one hell of a school. He led his mare away down the road without another word. Caleb climbed back onto the wagon and waited for Eleanor to settle beside him before releasing the brake. They rode in silence for a 1/4 mile. Then Caleb said without looking at her, "School teachers do not diagnose sand colic by palpation." Eleanor said nothing. "They do not carry mineral oil in their bags either." Still nothing. Caleb let the silence sit between them like a third passenger. Then he picked up the reins and clicked the horses forward. "When you are ready to tell me what you really are, I will listen. Until then, I will not push." He felt her eyes on him, felt her measuring, weighing, deciding. Then she turned away and watched the road ahead, and neither of them said another word until they reached the ranch. But when they arrived, Eleanor went straight to her trunk. She opened it, looked inside, and froze. Her face drained of what little color the cold had left in it. The lock had been tampered with. Scratch marks around the keyhole, the brass plate slightly bent. The top layer of her belongings, her clothes, her few personal items had been disturbed, moved, searched. She dug down to the false bottom with shaking fingers. The journal was still there, still hidden. Whoever had been through her trunk had not found it. But they had been looking. Eleanor's blood went cold. This was not Drummond. Drummond had no reason to search her things. He did not know about the journal. He did not know who she was. Someone else did. She relocked the trunk, moved it to the darkest corner of the cabin, and that night she slept with Dr. Whitfield's leather medical bag pressed against her chest, the blood-stained strap wrapped around her wrist. Caleb checked the rifle hanging above the door. Eleanor checked the lock on her trunk. Both of them had something to protect, and neither had told the other what it was. The first time Doc Harlan came to Haven Creek, he came with a warning. The second time, he would come with something worse. Word of the Porter horse cure spread across the frozen plains faster than a brush fire in August. Within a week, 2 more families showed up at Caleb's ranch looking for the woman with the healing hands. First came the Dawson family, a young couple from the next valley with a lamb that had developed pneumonia, rattling with every breath, too weak to stand on its own. Eleanor examined the animal in the barn, mixed a poultice from dried herbs she had brought in her bag, showed the wife how to apply it, and gave strict instructions for keeping the lamb warm and hydrated. The lamb survived. The Dawsons told their neighbors. Then came old Henry Walker with a dog that had been torn up by a coyote. 3 deep gashes along the ribs, muscle showing through. The kind of wounds that most people would have answered with a bullet and a shovel. Eleanor cleaned the wounds with boiled water and whiskey, stitched them with thread she had sterilized over a candle flame, and wrapped the dog in clean cloth with hands so steady they might have been carved from stone. The dog survived, too. Dog survived. Walker told everyone he met. Each time, Eleanor's competence became more obvious. Each time, the unasked question hung heavier in the air. Where did a schoolteacher from Philadelphia learn to do these things? It was on a Thursday afternoon, gray and bitter cold, when Doc Emmett Harlan rode out to the ranch. Harlan was 60 years old and looked 70. He had been the only physician in Casper for 15 years, which meant he had delivered babies, set bones, amputated limbs, and watched people die when his knowledge ran out, which it did more often than he cared to admit. Once, he had been competent, dedicated even. But somewhere in the long procession of frontier suffering, he had found whiskey, and whiskey had been a more reliable companion than any patient or principal. He rode up to the cabin on a sway-backed gelding, his coat buttoned wrong and his hat pulled low against the wind. He did not dismount right away. He sat in the saddle and looked at the ranch with eyes that were red-rimmed but sharp, taking in the improvements that had been made since Eleanor's arrival. The repaired fence posts, the cleared path between the cabin and the barn, the smoke rising steady and strong from the chimney. Signs of life where there had been signs of surrender. Then he swung down, tied his horse, and knocked on the door. Eleanor opened it. She took one look at Doc Harlan and understood exactly what kind of visit this was. She had seen that expression before, on the faces of men who felt threatened by things they could not control. The school superintendent in Philadelphia had worn it. The shop owner whose son had cornered her in the stockroom had worn it. Men with authority and credentials, confronted by a woman who did not need either. "Dr. Harlan," she said, "would you like to come inside?" He came inside. He refused coffee. He stood in the middle of the cabin with his hands behind his back and his chin lifted, wielding his authority like a weapon. "I will be direct, Miss Shaw. Or is it Mrs. Hartman now?" "Eleanor," she said. "Just Eleanor." "Fine. Eleanor." He leaned forward slightly. "You are practicing medicine without a license. In Wyoming territory, that is a criminal offense." "I am helping sick animals," Eleanor replied calmly. "That is not medicine. You treated the Henderson girl's cough last week. That is a human patient. That is medicine. I made her mother a tea and suggested she see a real doctor if the cough did not improve within a week. If that counts as practicing medicine, then every grandmother in this territory belongs behind bars." Harlan's eyes narrowed. He stepped closer, close enough that Eleanor could smell the whiskey on his breath, even at this hour of the afternoon. "I know what you are," he said quietly. "You are not a school teacher. School teachers do not suture wounds. They do not diagnose colic by palpation. They do not carry surgical tools in a leather bag with blood on the strap." The words hit Eleanor like a slap. She felt her pulse quicken but kept her face still. "I do not know where you learned what you know," Harlan continued. "And I do not particularly care. But if you keep at this, I will make trouble for you. That is not a threat. That is a professional courtesy." He turned and walked out without waiting for a response. Eleanor stood in the doorway and watched him ride away. And she felt the bitter, familiar taste of a pattern repeating. A man with power and position, threatened by a woman who knew things she was not supposed to know. Philadelphia all over again, just with more snow and fewer cobblestones. Caleb came in from the barn 20 minutes later and found Eleanor sitting at the table, staring at nothing. She told him about Harlan's visit, editing out the parts about the leather bag and the blood on the strap. Caleb listened without interrupting. Then he sat down across from her and said, "You are not just a school teacher." It was not a question. Eleanor went very still. The cabin was quiet except for the pop of the fire and the wind muttering against the walls. "No," she said. Caleb nodded slowly. He did not ask what she was, did not demand explanations or justifications. He just looked at her with those steady gray eyes and said, "When you are ready to tell me, I will listen. But I will not push." Then he stood up and walked out to check the cattle. The door closed behind him and Eleanor sat alone in the growing dark. And for the first time since she had fled Philadelphia, she thought, maybe I could trust this man. The thought terrified her more than Harlan's threats, more than the Pinkerton who was surely looking for her, more than the memory of Whitfield's face through the bars of his cell, telling her to run. Because trust meant vulnerability, and vulnerability meant another person could hurt her, and Eleanor Shaw had been hurt enough for one lifetime. She pushed the thought away, buried it under the work that needed doing. The cattle treatment had begun in earnest now, and there was no time for feelings. She and Caleb fell into a rhythm over the following days. Mornings were for the cattle. Eleanor had shown Caleb how to make the iron tonic, boiling scrap metal in water until it leached iron into the liquid, then mixing it with molasses to make a thick syrup. Twice a day, morning and evening, they went to the North Spring and drenched each animal, holding the cow's head while the other poured the tonic down its throat. It was brutal, exhausting work. The cattle fought it. Some of the tonic ended up in the snow, but Eleanor insisted that consistency mattered more than perfection, and Caleb trusted her enough by now to believe it. They worked in silence, mostly. Not uncomfortable silence, but the wordless coordination of two people moving toward a shared goal. She held the cow's head. He forced the tonic down. Their movements synchronized without discussion, as if their bodies had learned a language their mouths had not yet found. One afternoon, Eleanor was mixing tonic at the spring, her hands raw and bleeding from the cold. Caleb appeared beside her without a word, took the bucket from her hands, and finished the work himself. Their fingers brushed in the exchange, and neither of them commented on it. But later that night, lying in the dark on her side of the bed with Caleb on his, maintaining the careful distance they had silently agreed upon, Eleanor thought about his hands, scarred, strong, capable, but gentle with things he cared about. He was gentle with the cattle now, gentle in a way he had not been when she first arrived. She had seen him hold a calf's head with the same careful tenderness he might have used on a child. He is gentle with things he cares about, she thought. He just has not cared about anything in a long time. And then the other thought, the dangerous one, the one she could not afford. He is starting to care again. Meanwhile, the consequences of Eleanor's growing reputation were reaching places she could not see. One of Drummond's hired men, a hollow-cheeked drifter named Pike, had been riding past the ranch on the day Eleanor treated Porter's horse. He had seen the whole thing from the tree line, the examination, the mineral oil, the instructions delivered with an authority that did not match a schoolteacher from Philadelphia. Pike told Drummond. And Drummond, who had built his fortune by recognizing leverage when he saw it, filed the information away with the patience of a man who knew that secrets were more valuable than gold if you knew when to spend them. That same week, in the back room of the Three Rivers Saloon in Casper, Doc Harlan sat across from Silas Drummond with a glass of whiskey sweating between his palms. "I want that woman gone," Harlan said. His voice was thick with drink and wounded pride. Drummond smiled. It was not a pleasant expression. "So do I, Doc. So do I." He poured Harlan another drink and began to talk about arrangements, about connections, about the many ways a woman without friends or standing could be made to disappear from a frontier community, not through violence but through something more effective, through the law. The child stopped breathing at 3:17 in the afternoon. At 3:18, it was Caleb, not Eleanor, who brought her back. It was the last week of January when Samuel Porter rode up to the cabin at a dead gallop, his 7-year-old daughter Lucy cradled in his arms like something fragile and irreplaceable. His wife rode behind him on the second horse, her face white with the particular terror that only a parent knows. Caleb heard the hoofbeats from the barn and came out with a halter in one hand and alarm on his face. Porter's expression told him everything before the man said a word. "She has been sick 3 days, Porter said as he dismounted, holding Lucy tight against his chest. Started with a cough. Now she cannot catch her breath right. Wife says her lips were turning blue this morning." Eleanor appeared in the cabin doorway. She took one look at the child's face, the shallow, rapid breathing, the dusky color around her lips, and her whole body shifted into a mode Caleb had never seen before. Not the careful, measured woman who mixed tonics and checked cattle. Something sharper. Something that moved with the precision of a blade. "Bring her inside," Eleanor said. "Quickly. On the table. Gently. She was already clearing the table, pulling off the plates and cups and stacking them on the floor. Porter laid his daughter down and stepped back, his big hands opening and closing helplessly at his sides. Eleanor bent over the child. Her fingers found the pulse at Lucy's neck, checked the color of her gums, pressed gently along the small throat. She put her ear close to the girl's chest and listened with a focus so intense it seemed to bend the air around her. Then she straightened and her expression was grim. "This is croup," she said. "Severe. Her airways are inflamed and swollen. The breathing difficulty, the barking cough she has been having, the blue color, it all fits." Porter's face twisted. "Doc Harlan said it was pneumonia. Gave her some medicine yesterday. She has been worse ever since." Something cold settled in Eleanor's stomach. "What medicine?" Porter described it. Eleanor closed her eyes for just a moment, and Caleb saw her jaw clench. "That medication suppresses the cough reflex," Eleanor said carefully. "Croup patients need to cough. It is how the body tries to clear the swollen airway. The medicine Dr. Harlan gave is doing the opposite of what this child needs." She looked directly at Porter. "His treatment needs to stop immediately. I need to start steam inhalation to reduce the swelling. Honey and lemon for the throat. And we need to keep her upright, not lying flat. It makes the breathing worse." Porter stared at her. He was a man who had aligned himself with Drummond, who had doubted Eleanor, who had accepted her help for his horse with grudging reluctance. But his daughter was dying, and the licensed physician had made her worse, and right now Eleanor Shaw was the only person in the room who seemed to know what to do. "Do it," he said hoarsely. "Whatever you need to do, do it." Eleanor commanded the room. She sent Caleb to boil every pot of water they had. She sent Porter's wife to hold Lucy upright, propping her against pillows. She found the dried eucalyptus she'd been keeping in her medical bag, crushed it, and dropped it into the boiling water, creating a thick medicinal steam that filled the cabin. She draped blankets over the table to trap the vapor and had Mrs. Porter sit with Lucy beneath it, breathing the moist air. For 2 hours, Eleanor worked with a controlled intensity that bordered on frightening. She rotated Lucy's position every 20 minutes. She mixed a honey and lemon syrup and administered it in small, careful spoonfuls. She monitored the child's breathing with obsessive attention, her fingers finding the pulse again and again, counting, calculating, adjusting. The cabin was sweltering. Steam rose from every surface. Sweat ran down Eleanor's face and soaked the collar of her dress. Caleb stoked the fire and boiled more water and followed every instruction Eleanor gave without question. Slowly, impossibly slowly, Lucy's breathing began to ease. The blue tinge faded from her lips. The desperate gasping gave way to something that sounded more like normal respiration. Eleanor allowed herself one small breath of relief. And then, at 3:17 by the clock on the mantel, Lucy stopped breathing entirely. One moment the child was improving. The next, her chest stopped moving. Her eyes were closed. Her small body went limp in her mother's arms. Mrs. Porter screamed. Eleanor lunged forward. Her hands found Lucy's chest, her throat, searching for the obstruction. Her mouth was moving, saying things, giving instructions. But Caleb could see that her hands were shaking. Not with cold, with something else. Something that had frozen her from the inside out. He looked at her face and saw it. Terror. Not the controlled concern she had shown before. Pure, paralyzing terror. Her eyes were wide and unfocused. And she was not looking at Lucy anymore. She was looking at something 1,000 miles away. Something that had happened years ago. Caleb did not know about the boy in Montana. Did not know about the 7-year-old who had been kicked by a horse, who had bled internally, who had died in Eleanor's arms because the nearest surgeon was 3 days away. He did not know that Eleanor carried that death inside her like a stone in her chest, and that seeing another child stop breathing had triggered something that shut down every circuit in her remarkable mind. But he knew she was frozen. And he knew that if someone did not act in the next few seconds, Lucy Porter was going to die. Something very old surfaced in Caleb Hartman. Not the rancher, not the drunk, not the grieving widower. The thing before all of that. The boy who had watched his mother save his baby sister's life in a farmhouse in Virginia, when the infant choked on a piece of peach. His mother had flipped the baby upside down and struck her back with the flat of her hand until the obstruction flew free. Caleb grabbed Lucy from her mother's arms. He flipped the child, holding her by the ankles, and struck her firmly between the shoulder blades with his open palm. Once. The sound was shockingly loud in the steam-filled cabin. Twice. On the second strike, Lucy coughed. A harsh, wet, ugly sound. That was the most beautiful thing anyone in that room had ever heard. Then she gasped. Then she screamed. She was breathing. Porter sagged against the wall. His wife collapsed onto the nearest chair, sobbing. Eleanor stood motionless, her hands still raised in front of her, shaking violently, staring at the child in Caleb's arms as if she could not understand what had just happened. Caleb held Lucy until her breathing stabilized, then gently handed her back to her mother. The girl was crying, which was fine. Crying meant breathing, and breathing meant alive, meant... He turned to Eleanor. She had not moved. The trembling had spread from her hands to her whole body, and her face was the color of old ash. "Eleanor," he said quietly, "she is breathing. You hear me? She is breathing." Eleanor blinked, came back from wherever she had gone, looked at Lucy, who was clinging to her mother and wailing with the full force of her small lungs. Then Eleanor's legs gave out and she sat down heavily on the floor. She did not faint. She simply crumbled, like a wall that had been holding back a flood, and finally could not hold any more. Tears came without sound at first, then with great shuddering sobs that shook her entire frame. Caleb had never seen her cry, had never seen her show anything beyond controlled competence and measured determination. This was something else entirely. This was a woman breaking open. The Porters were too occupied with their daughter to notice. Caleb knelt beside Eleanor on the floor and did not touch her, did not speak, just placed himself between her and the rest of the room so that no one else could see her fall apart. After a long time, the sobs subsided. Eleanor wiped her face with the back of her hand and stared at the floor. "There was a boy," she said. Her voice was raw, scraped hollow. "In Montana. 7 years old. A horse kicked him. Internal bleeding. I knew what was wrong. Knew exactly what a surgeon could do to fix it. But the nearest hospital was 3 days away, and he did not have 3 days." She swallowed hard. "He died in my arms, and his mother blamed me. Said if I really knew what I was doing, her son would still be alive." The silence that followed was the kind that has weight. Caleb did not say it was not your fault because he had learned that those words, however true, never helped anyone who was carrying that kind of guilt. He knew because people had said the same thing to him about Margaret, and it had never once made the weight lighter. Instead, he stood up, poured coffee, set the cup in front of her on the floor, and sat back down. "You saved that girl today," he said after a while. "You saved her." I froze. "You set everything up. The steam, the position, the treatment, all of it was right." "I just hit a kid on the back. That is not exactly medicine," she laughed. A broken, wet, exhausted laugh. "Do not undersell it." Then quietly, "Caleb, thank you for not telling me it is going to be fine. Everyone always says that. It never helps. I do not know if it is going to be fine, but I know you are still here, still trying. That counts for something." They sat on the floor together as the steam dissipated and the cabin slowly cooled. Porter took his daughter home with detailed instructions from Eleanor, who had pulled herself back together with the force of will that Caleb was beginning to understand was her primary survival mechanism. Lucy was sleeping naturally when they left, her breathing easy, the color back in her face. After the Porters were gone, Caleb tried to do something he should not have. He tried to comfort Eleanor further, touched her shoulder, said something about how brave she had been. Eleanor pulled away. I do not need your pity. The words came out sharp as a blade, and Caleb felt them cut. That is not pity, Eleanor. Then what is it? It is concern. But clearly you cannot tell the difference. The words landed hard, true and painful. Eleanor flinched but said nothing. Caleb turned and walked outside into the cold, and the distance between them that night was wider than it had been since the night she arrived. They slept on opposite sides of the bed without speaking. Two people who cared about each other and had no idea how to do it without causing damage. And in town, in the back room of the Three Rivers Saloon, Silas Drummond poured another drink for Doc Harlan and listened to the old physician rage about the woman who had publicly contradicted him and saved the child he could not save. She humiliated you, Drummond said, his voice smooth as oiled leather. In front of Porter. In front of the whole county, really. A woman with no credentials, no training, no right to be doing what she is doing, correcting a licensed physician, making you look incompetent. Harlan drank and said nothing, but his eyes burned. If you wanted, Drummond continued, leaning back in his chair, I could help you address the situation. Professionally, of course, through proper channels. There are laws about practicing medicine without a license. There are ways to make a woman like that disappear from a community without anyone having to get their hands dirty. Harlan looked at Drummond. The whiskey had blurred the line between wounded pride and genuine malice, and he could no longer tell where one ended and the other began. What do you have in mind, he said. Drummond smiled. The alliance was sealed. Virgil Crenshaw came to the ranch at dawn. This time he did not shoot through the window. He knocked on the door and smiled. Caleb answered with the rifle already in his hands. He had heard the horse approaching from 50 yards out, had recognized the particular cadence of Virgil's bay gelding, and had been standing behind the door with his finger on the trigger guard before the first knock landed. Virgil stood on the porch with his hat in his hands, smiling the way a wolf smiles at a fence it knows it can jump. Behind him, 2 other men sat on horseback at the edge of the yard. Caleb did not recognize them, which meant Drummond had hired outside help. That was not a good sign. Morning, Hartman. Virgil's voice was pleasant, conversational, completely at odds with the threat his presence represented. Mr. Drummond sends his regards. And a new offer. He produced a folded paper from his coat and held it out. Caleb did not take it. The offer is better than last time, Virgil continued. Considerably better. Mr. Drummond understands that the winter has been difficult. He wants to be fair. Fair, Caleb said. Virgil's smile widened. Winter is a hard thing, Hartman. Lot of bad things can happen. Barn fires, sick cattle, accidents. He looked past Caleb into the cabin where Eleanor was standing in the shadows, listening. Lot of things can happen to people, too. The threat was not even thinly veiled. It was naked, standing on his porch in the morning light, smiling. Caleb raised the rifle. The barrel came to rest against Virgil's sternum, right over the heart. Get off my land, Caleb said. Tell Drummond the next man he sends will not ride back. Something flickered behind Virgil's eyes. Not quite fear. More like recalculation. He put his hat back on, folded the paper, tucked it into his coat. Your choice, Hartman. He turned and walked to his horse with the deliberate slowness of a man who wanted to make clear that he was leaving by choice, not by force. The 2 riders fell in behind him, and they rode away without looking back. Eleanor came to the door after they were gone. She had heard everything. Caleb, she said, the water, the contamination. It is not an accident, is it? He looked at her. No, I do not think it is. Eleanor sat down at the table and folded her hands. She spoke carefully, laying out the case the way Dr. Whitfield would have, building from evidence to conclusion. The symptoms in the cattle were consistent with copper poisoning. Drummond's mine was upstream. The timeline matched. Cattle started dying after the mine began operations. And now Drummond was trying to buy the land. He is poisoning the water to drive you off, Eleanor said. If your cattle die and the bank forecloses, he gets the land for nothing. Caleb was quiet for a long moment. Then he stood, took down his heavy coat, and reached for his hat. Where are you going? Eleanor asked. to talk to the neighbors. If Drummond is doing this to me, he is doing it to all of us. He rode out that morning and did not return until after dark. What he found confirmed everything. 3 neighboring ranches had lost cattle with identical symptoms over the past 6 months. All 3 had received purchase offers from Drummond Mining. All 3 had been turned away by the town sheriff when they tried to file complaints. At each stop, Caleb said the same thing. 1 man alone Drummond crushes. 10 men standing together, he has to think twice. 3 ranchers agreed to stand. It was not an army, but it was a start. For a week after that, Drummond went quiet. No visits, no threats, no letters. The silence should have been ominous, but instead it felt like reprieve. The ranch fell into a rhythm of work and recovery that felt almost normal. The cattle were improving, not dramatically but steadily. The roan heifer that Eleanor had saved on the first day was gaining weight, her coat showing the faintest hint of shine. 2 others that had been unable to stand were now walking the paddock on their own. The iron tonic was working. Eleanor's reputation continued to grow. Families brought gifts when they came for help. A jar of preserves, some candles, a length of good rope, a sack of oats for the cattle. Women who had turned up their noses at the idea of a mail-order bride started coming to Eleanor with their own ailments. A cough that would not quit, a rash on a child's arm, a husband's bad back. Eleanor helped them all, never set a price, never refused what was offered, never promised more than she could deliver. She was becoming something that had not existed in this community before. Not a doctor, not a midwife, not a folk healer. Something new. Something needed. One evening, sitting on the porch after dinner, watching the stars come out over the snow-covered plains, Eleanor laughed at something Caleb said. It was a real laugh, full and bright and completely unguarded, and the sound of it hit Caleb in the chest like a physical thing. He had never heard her laugh before. Not really. Not like that. And he realized, sitting there in the cold with the stars overhead and this woman beside him, that he wanted to hear that sound again. Wanted it the way a starving man wants bread. It was a dangerous feeling, he knew that. Caring about someone meant the possibility of losing them. And Caleb had already lost the one person he had cared about most. The grave on the hill behind the cabin was proof of what happened when he let himself need someone. But the laugh lingered in his ears, and he could not make himself unhear it. The argument came 3 days later. It started about strategy and ended up being about everything. Caleb wanted to ride into Casper and confront Drummond directly. Call him out in front of the whole town. Force a public reckoning. Eleanor wanted to gather evidence first. Document the contamination. Collect sworn statements from the affected ranchers. Build a case that could stand up in front of a judge. They disagreed. The disagreement escalated. And somewhere between the practical question of tactics and the personal question of trust, the conversation turned into something much more raw. You always have to control everything, do you not? Caleb said. His voice was tight with frustration. Because the last time I let someone else take control, I lost everything I had. The words came out of Eleanor like they had been stored under pressure, and the room went very quiet. They stared at each other across the table, both breathing hard, both knowing they had crossed into territory that had nothing to do with Drummond or cattle or contaminated water. Caleb was the first to leave. He walked out to the porch and sat in the cold for a long time, watching his breath freeze in the air, and feeling the silence of the land settle around him like a blanket that was too thin for the weather. Eleanor came out an hour later. She did not sit down. She stood at the railing with her arms wrapped around herself and spoke without looking at him. You are right. I control because control is the only thing that has kept me alive. Every time I have trusted someone else to handle things, every time I have let go, I have been punished for it. So I hold on, even when it pushes people away, even when it pushes you away. Caleb was quiet for a moment. Then he said, and I want to fight because fighting means I do not have to think. Thinking makes me look at things I would rather forget. They stood there in the dark, 2 people who understood each other better through conflict than they ever could through harmony. The argument had not been pleasant, but it had been honest, And honesty was the currency they had been trading in since the night Eleanor walked through his door. That night, lying in the darkness on their respective sides of the bed, Eleanor spoke again. "Caleb. There are things about me you do not know, things that might make you want me to leave." Silence. Long and heavy. "There is nothing that would make me want you to leave. You have not heard what I have to say, do not need to." But Eleanor knew he was wrong. Because 400 miles east, in an office in Philadelphia, a man named Thomas Garrett had just hired a Pinkerton detective. And the only photograph the detective carried was a charcoal sketch of Eleanor Shaw's face. Eleanor was standing in front of the post office bulletin board, a package of medicines in one hand, and her own face staring back at her from a yellow handbill pinned to the cork. She had come into town for supplies, simple as that. A routine trip she had made 3 times now, each time a little less uncomfortable than the last, as the community slowly adjusted to her presence. She had stopped at the post office to check for mail, something she almost never received. And there it was. The handbill was printed on cheap yellow paper, the kind used for auction notices and public announcements. At the top, in bold block letters, it read, "Seeking Witness." Below that was a charcoal sketch of a woman's face. Her face. The resemblance was not perfect, but it was close enough that anyone who had spent time with Eleanor would recognize it. Beneath the sketch, the text read, "Eleanor Shaw, formerly of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Wanted as material witness in the matter of Commonwealth versus Dr. Josiah Whitfield, Lancaster County. Any person with knowledge of this woman's whereabouts is asked to contact the Pinkerton National Detective Agency in Cheyenne, Wyoming territory." Eleanor's blood turned to ice water. She knew exactly how this had happened. After she saved Porter's daughter Lucy, someone, probably one of the mill workers' wives, had written a letter to relatives in Cheyenne, describing the remarkable healer woman who had moved to the Casper area. Such stories traveled in frontier communities like ripples in still water, spreading outward in all directions. A local newspaper in Cheyenne had picked it up. A small item, buried on page 4. "Miracle healer woman saves dying child near Casper." Thomas Garrett's Pinkerton detective had read it. And he had sent these handbills to every post office in Wyoming territory. The thing that saved her, her gift for healing, was the same thing that had exposed her. The irony was so perfect, it was almost cruel. Eleanor tore the handbill from the board with numb fingers and stuffed it into her coat pocket. But as she turned to leave, she saw Martha Henderson standing just inside the post office door. Martha, the boarding house owner. Martha, the town's most reliable gossip. Martha, whose eyes were wide and whose mouth was already forming the shape of a story she could not wait to tell. Martha had seen the handbill. Martha had read it. And Martha had already told the clerk behind the counter, who would tell his wife, who would tell Mrs. Dawson, who would tell everyone. Eleanor walked out of the post office and climbed into the wagon and drove home without stopping for the supplies she had come for. The whole way back, her hands gripped the reins so tight that her knuckles went white, and her mind raced through possibilities like a horse through burning timber. She could run. She had done it before. Pack the trunk, take the journal, disappear into the vastness of the frontier. She knew how to be invisible. She had practiced it for 6 months. But running meant leaving Caleb, leaving the ranch, leaving the cattle she had nursed back from the edge of death and the community that was just beginning to trust her. It meant leaving the first place in 5 years where she had felt something close to belonging. She could not do it. She would not. When she got back to the cabin, Caleb was splitting wood in the yard. He looked up when the wagon pulled in, and something in her face made him set down the axe immediately. "What happened?" he said. Eleanor climbed down from the wagon. She stood in the yard in the cold, in the fading afternoon light, and she told him everything. Not the edited version, not the careful, controlled account she had rehearsed in her mind 100 times. Everything. She told him about Dr. Josiah Whitfield, the veterinary surgeon in Lancaster County, who had taught her everything she knew. about the 3 years she had spent as his assistant, learning animal medicine and herbal remedies and diagnostic technique. About how Whitfield had treated her as an intellectual equal, the only man who ever had. She told him about Edward Garrett, Jr., the 22-year-old son of a wealthy industrialist named Thomas Garrett, who had come to Whitfield with a ruptured appendix. About the emergency surgery that Whitfield performed correctly by the book, with Eleanor assisting. About the young man dying on the table because he was already too far gone to save, because his appendix had burst days earlier and the infection had spread to his blood. She told him about the Garrett family's fury, their money and connections, how they bought witnesses, pressured the district attorney, had Whitfield arrested and charged with manslaughter, how Whitfield sat in a county jail cell right now, waiting for a trial that was rigged against him. She told him about the journal, Whitfield's personal record of every case, every procedure, every treatment, including the complete surgical notes from the Garrett operation, notes that proved beyond any doubt that Whitfield had followed correct procedure and that the patient was already dying when surgery began. She told him about Thomas Garrett's men coming to her boarding house, first with money to buy her silence, then with threats, and finally the man who broke in at night, who she heard on the stairs and escaped through the window with nothing but her clothes, the medical bag, and the journal hidden in a trunk with a false bottom she had sewn herself. She told him about the blood on the strap, how the journal had been inside the bag on the night of the Garrett surgery, how the blood had soaked through during the operation, and how she had never been able to wash it out completely. She told him she was a coward, that she had run when she should have stayed and testified, that Whitfield was rotting in a cell because she had chosen her own survival over his freedom, that she lived with that guilt every single day, every single hour, and that it was eating her alive from the inside. Then she stopped talking and waited for the blow to fall. Caleb did not speak for a long time. He stood in the yard with wood chips on his sleeves and his breath making slow clouds in the cold air, and he did not look at her. Then he said, "You left a man in a jail cell to save yourself." "Yes, and you have been living with that every day since. Every second." He turned and walked toward the cabin. Eleanor watched him through the window, standing on the porch, staring out at the land with his back to her. He stood there for 30 minutes. She counted. Each minute felt like an hour. She was certain he was going to tell her to leave, was already mentally packing her trunk, planning her route, calculating how far she could get before dark. Then he came back inside. His eyes were red but dry. He sat down across from her at the table and spoke in a voice that was rough with something she had never heard from him before. Honesty so raw, it seemed to hurt him. "I let Margaret die," he said, "because I was too proud to admit I needed help, too stubborn to leave the ranch for 2 days during calving season. She asked me to take her to the doctor. She begged me, and I said, 'Next week, Maggie. After calving, I will take you next week.'" He swallowed hard. There was no next week. Eleanor stared at him. The guilt she saw in his face was a mirror of her own. The same corrosive, relentless self-blame that turns every good day into an accusation and every quiet moment into a courtroom. "You are not the only one carrying guilt, Eleanor, and I am the last man on earth who gets to judge you for running when things got hard." He met her eyes. "I ran too. I just did it without leaving the house." The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of something. Recognition. Two people who had been drowning in their own private oceans of shame, suddenly realizing they were not alone in the water. "We need to send the journal to Whitfield's defense attorney," Caleb said. "That evidence can free him. If we send it, the Pinkerton will know where I am. The Garrett family will know. Then let them come. I will be here." He said it simply, without bravado, the way he might say the sun rises in the east, a statement of fact rather than a declaration of heroism. By now, the damage from the handbill was spreading. Martha Henderson had done what Martha Henderson did best. Within 2 days, the entire town knew that Eleanor Shaw was wanted in connection with a case in Pennsylvania. The specifics were garbled in retelling, as they always are. Some said she was a criminal. Some said she had killed a man. Some said she was a fugitive from justice. Doc Harlan brought the news to Drummond, who received it with the satisfaction of a man watching pieces fall into place on a chessboard. A woman being hunted, living with Hartman, with secrets she wants to keep buried. Drummond sat in his office and calculated the possibilities. He could threaten to expose Eleanor to the Pinkerton unless Caleb sold the ranch. He could use her status as a wanted witness to discredit her testimony about the water contamination. He could turn the town against her, and by extension, against Caleb. 2 problems, 1 solution. Drummond poured himself a drink and began to plan. Back at the ranch, night had fallen. The cabin was warm, the fire casting moving shadows on the walls. Eleanor sat at the table with her hands folded, waiting for whatever came next. "You still want me here?" she asked. Caleb looked at her across the table. She was not asking from a place of vulnerability. She was asking from a place of defiance, chin up, eyes hard, expecting rejection and daring him to deliver it. He stood up, crossed the small space between them, and kissed her. Not gentle, not tentative. Fierce and desperate, the way you kiss someone when you know that tomorrow might take everything away, when you have been standing at the edge of a cliff for months and finally decide to jump. Eleanor stiffened. Then her hands came up and gripped the front of his shirt. And she kissed him back with the same ferocity, the same desperate hunger for something real in a world that had given them both so much that was false. When they broke apart, breathing hard, foreheads touching, Caleb said, "That is my answer. That is my..." Eleanor closed her eyes. A single tear tracked down her cheek. She did not wipe it away. "Tomorrow," she whispered. "We send the journal." "Tomorrow," Caleb agreed. "Tonight, we are here." They stayed like that for a long time, standing in the firelight, holding on to each other the way 2 drowning people hold on to the same piece of wreckage. Not because it will necessarily save them, but because holding on is better than going under alone. The next morning, Virgil Crenshaw returned. This time he did not come alone, and he did not knock. The barn caught fire at 4 in the morning. When Caleb ran out, the first bullet hit the porch post 3 inches from his head. He had been sleeping lightly the way soldiers sleep, with one ear open and one hand on the rifle under the bed. The smell of smoke reached him first, sharp and wrong, cutting through the winter cold like a knife through cloth. Then the orange glow through the window. Then the sound of cattle bellowing in terror. He was on his feet before he was fully awake, pulling on boots, grabbing the rifle. Eleanor was already up, already moving, her instincts honed by months of midnight emergencies and a lifetime of being hunted. "Stay inside," Caleb ordered. "Cover the front door." He went out the back window. The night air hit him like a wall of ice, but the adrenaline running through his veins burned hotter than any cold. The barn was fully ablaze, flames climbing the walls and licking at the roof, throwing wild orange light across the snow-covered yard. Against that light, he could see shapes. 3 men on horseback silhouetted against the fire, positioned in a rough semicircle around the cabin. The first shot came when he stepped off the porch. It punched into the post beside his head, sending splinters into his cheek. He dropped flat, rolled behind the water trough, and came up with the rifle shouldered. But he did not fire. Not yet. In the firelight, he could see Virgil Crenshaw dismounting near the barn, a torch still smoldering in his hand. The other 2 men were holding position, rifles ready, watching the cabin. Their goal was not murder. Caleb understood that with the cold clarity of a man who had survived 4 years of war by reading battlefields the way other men read newspapers. They were here to destroy, not to kill. Burn the barn, scatter the cattle, break the ranch beyond recovery, leave Caleb with nothing to fight for and nothing to fight with. The old soldier surfaced. Not the rancher, not the drunk, not the grieving husband. Something older and harder, forged in the Shenandoah Valley, and tempered by a war that had stripped away everything soft and left only the things that kept a man alive. Caleb moved through the darkness the way he had moved through enemy lines 20 years ago. low, silent, using every shadow and every fold in the terrain. He circled behind the barn, keeping the fire between himself and the two mounted men. The heat was brutal on his left side, the cold savage on his right, and the smoke made his eyes stream. But he could see Virgil clearly now, standing near the barn door, watching the fire with the satisfaction of a man admiring his own work. Caleb covered the last 20 yards at a dead sprint. Virgil heard him too late. He spun, reaching for the pistol on his hip, but Caleb was already on him. The collision took them both to the ground. Virgil was strong, with the wiry strength of a man who had survived 4 years in the territorial prison. But Caleb had something Virgil did not. He had something worth fighting for. The fight was short and brutal. No guns, no knives, just fists and elbows and the desperate efficiency of close combat. Caleb took a blow to the ribs that sent pain lancing through his chest. He answered with an elbow to Virgil's jaw that snapped the man's head sideways. Then he got behind Virgil, locked his arm around the man's neck, and squeezed until Virgil stopped struggling. He did not kill him. He broke his arm, a clean snap at the elbow that made Virgil scream into the snow, then flipped him face down and held him there with a knee between his shoulder blades. The two mounted men saw Virgil go down. In the dancing firelight, with the barn roaring behind them, they made a calculation. Whatever Drummond was paying them, it was not enough for this. They wheeled their horses and disappeared into the darkness. Meanwhile, Eleanor had not stayed inside. The moment she heard the cattle screaming, she was out the cabin door and running toward the barn. Not thinking, not calculating, just moving on the pure instinct of a woman who had spent months bringing these animals back from the brink of death and was not about to let them die in a fire. The heat was staggering. The barn was fully engulfed, flames 30 feet high, roaring like a living thing. But the cattle were still inside, those that had not already broken through the weakened walls, and their screams were the worst sound Eleanor had ever heard. She forced the main door open. Smoke and heat billowed out. She could see shapes inside, cattle milling in panic, crashing against walls and each other. She grabbed a rope, tied it around the nearest fence post, and waded in. She got 5 head out before the burning roof started to collapse. She went back in for the 6th, a young bull calf that was pressed against the far wall, frozen with terror. She got a rope on him and was pulling him toward the door, when a panicked cow, a 1,500-pound animal blind with fear, slammed into her from the side. The impact threw Eleanor against the fence. She felt her collarbone snap, a hot white crack of pain that stole her breath and turned her vision to static. For a moment she could not move, could not think, could not do anything but lie in the snow and try to remember how to breathe. Then she got up, one-armed, gasping, shoulder screaming. She kept pulling the calf toward safety. She got him out. Then she went back for another. By the time Caleb reached her, Eleanor had saved 11 head of cattle from the burning barn. 3 had not made it out. The barn itself was a total loss, nothing but flame and collapsing timbers, and the terrible smell of things that should not burn. Eleanor was sitting in the snow near the fence, her left arm hanging at a wrong angle, her face black with soot, still giving Caleb instructions about where to move the surviving cattle. He knelt beside her and saw the collarbone displacement through her torn dress. His hands started shaking, not from cold, from the sudden overwhelming realization of how close he had come to losing her. "Do not ever do that again," he said. "Run into a burning barn or get hit by a cow, either, both. Don't go out and fight 3 armed men by yourself. Deal." They both knew they would do it all again, every bit of it. But the fear of losing each other was new and raw, and it sat between them like a third presence, demanding to be acknowledged. Doc Harlan arrived an hour later. The fire had been visible from town, and several riders had come to investigate. Harlan rode up, saw the smoking ruins of the barn, saw Eleanor sitting on the ground with a clearly broken collarbone, saw Virgil Crenshaw tied to a chair inside the cabin with his arm splinted using a piece of firewood and a torn bedsheet. Nobody had asked for Harlan. Nobody expected him to help. But something happened in that moment that none of them, least of all Harlan himself could have predicted. He knelt beside Eleanor without a word. His hands, which had trembled with drink for the better part of a decade, were steady. He examined the collarbone with the careful, practiced touch of the physician he had once been. He set it with a single firm movement that made Eleanor gasp and then sag with relief. He fashioned a sling from a strip of clean cloth and secured her arm against her body. Neither of them spoke about what this meant, but both of them knew. Harlan had not been told about Drummond's plan to burn the barn. He had been used, manipulated, weaponized, against a woman whose only crime was being better at his job than he was. And now, kneeling in the snow beside that woman, setting her broken bone with hands that remembered what they were for, something cracked in the wall of his resentment. It was not forgiveness. Not yet. But it was the first fracture, the first light through the stone. Samuel Porter arrived at dawn. He stood in the yard and looked at the destruction. The skeleton of the barn still smoking, the exhausted cattle huddled near the cabin. Eleanor with her arm in a sling, face drawn with pain. Caleb with a gash across his cheekbone and bruises darkening along his ribs. Virgil tied up and groaning. Porter was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was stripped of its usual hardness. "Drummond promised me no one would get hurt." "Drummond lied," Caleb said. "That is the only thing he is good at." More silence. Porter looked at Eleanor, at the woman who had saved his horse, saved his daughter, and was now sitting in the ruins of her home with a broken bone and no self-pity. "I will testify," Porter said, "about everything Drummond told me, everything he promised, everything he planned." He turned and rode away without another word. But the words he left behind changed the shape of everything that followed. That night, in the damaged cabin with cold seeping through walls that the fire's heat had warped, Caleb changed Eleanor's bandage. She sat on the edge of the bed and let him work, and for the first time since he had known her, she did not insist she was fine, did not push him away, did not arm her up against the vulnerability of letting someone take care of her. She just sat there, quiet, and let his hands do what they needed to do. And that simple act of surrender, of letting go of control, of trusting another person with her pain, meant more than any kiss or any declaration. It was the real turning point. Not romance, trust. The next morning, they acted on 3 fronts simultaneously. Caleb loaded Virgil into a wagon and drove him to the United States Marshal's office in Cheyenne, bypassing the local sheriff entirely. Porter rode to the territorial courthouse and filed a sworn statement detailing Drummond's offers, threats, and promises. And Eleanor packaged Dr. Whitfield's journal in oilcloth, wrapped it in brown paper, and addressed it to the law firm of Henderson and Wells in Philadelphia, care of the defense attorney in the matter of Commonwealth versus Dr. Josiah Whitfield. She stood at the post office window and handed the package to the clerk. Her hands did not shake. 3 actions, 3 delayed explosions, all triggered on the same day. Judge William Callahan rode into Casper with 2 deputy United States Marshals flanking him like bookends. Silas Drummond arrived an hour later with 3 lawyers from Cheyenne in a hired coach. Eleanor knew the moment she saw them that the real battle would not be fought with guns or fists. It would be fought with paper and words and the weight of public opinion. The hearing was held in the Casper Town Hall, a drafty wooden building that served as courthouse, meeting house, and dance hall depending on the day. Every seat was taken. People stood along the walls and crowded in the doorway. The whole community had come to watch. Judge Callahan sat at a table at the front, the 2 marshals behind him. He was a weathered man in his 60s who had ridden the circuit for 20 years and had seen enough frontier justice to be surprised by very little. He called the proceedings to order with the weary authority of a man who wanted this finished so he could get to the next town before the weather turned. Virgil Crenshaw had already given a full statement to the marshals in Cheyenne, trading everything he knew for a reduced sentence. Arson, intimidation, deliberate contamination of water sources, all directed and financed by Silas Drummond. Porter's sworn statement corroborated and expanded the picture. Together, they painted a portrait of systematic corruption that even Drummond's expensive lawyers could not paper over. But Drummond was not done. His lead attorney, a sharp-featured man named Crawford from Cheyenne, rose with the Pinkerton handbill in his hand. "Your Honor, this woman is a fugitive from justice in Pennsylvania. She is wanted in connection with a manslaughter case. Her testimony is compromised, her character suspect. Everything she has claimed about my client's operations is the fabrication of a desperate woman with every reason to create distractions from her own legal troubles." The room went cold. Eleanor felt every eye turn to her. The old familiar dread settled in her chest, the same dread she had felt in Philadelphia when the superintendent's lies destroyed her teaching career. The same dread she had felt when the seamstress accused her of theft. The same dread of being a woman alone in a room full of people who had the power to destroy her. Then Caleb stood up. He was not a man given to public speaking. He was not comfortable with words the way Eleanor was, not skilled at argument or persuasion. But he stood up in that room full of people and he spoke. And what he said was simple and true and carried the weight of a man who had earned the right to be heard. He called Porter first. Porter testified about his horse and his daughter, about how Eleanor had diagnosed sand colic when Doc Harlan would have let the mare die, about how she had saved Lucy when Harlan's treatment was killing her. He called the Morrison family, whose son had broken his leg in a fall from a horse. Eleanor had set the bone, splinted it properly, and the boy was walking again with barely a limp. He called Mrs. Henderson, whose daughter's cough had been cured by Eleanor's tea. He called the Dawson family, the Walker family, the mill workers who had been injured when a cable snapped at the lumber operation. 3 men with broken bones and gashes that Eleanor had treated when no other help was available. 17 witnesses, one after another. Ranchers and their wives, mill workers, mothers, children, others, each telling the court how this woman, this alleged fugitive, this woman without credentials or connections, had saved their animals, their children, their lives. Some of them had been skeptical of her. Some had gossiped about her. But not one of them lied on that stand, because the truth was too big and too obvious to deny. Caleb stood at the front of the room after the last witness and said, "This is the woman you are calling a fraud. She has saved more lives in this county than anyone in this room, including the doctor." The room was silent. Not the silence of uncertainty, but the silence of something shifting. A community recognizing, perhaps for the first time, what it had in its midst. Then Doc Harlan stood up. Nobody expected it. Drummond's lawyers certainly did not. They had counted on Harlan as their witness, the licensed physician who would testify that Eleanor was a dangerous fraud practicing medicine illegally. Instead, Harlan walked to the front of the room, his hands trembling, his face the color of old parchment, and said this, "She is better than me. She has been better than me since the day she arrived. I am a drunk with shaking hands, and this woman set a compound fracture, treated sand colic by palpation, and delivered correct diagnoses that I missed. I hated her for it. Drummond used that hatred." He turned and looked directly at Drummond. "You told me you just wanted fairness. You lied." The room erupted. Callahan banged his gavel. "Order! Order!" When quiet returned, Eleanor stood. She walked to the front of the room and addressed the court in a voice that did not waver. "I am a trained medical assistant. I was taught by Dr. Josiah Whitfield over the course of 3 years. I am being sought as a witness in his trial, not as a criminal. The journal I carried contained evidence of his innocence. I have sent it to his defense attorney. Yes, I ran. I was threatened, and I was afraid, and I ran. I am not proud of that. But I am done running." There was a moment, brief but unmistakable, when Silas Drummond's composure cracked. He sat in his chair and watched his lawyers shuffle papers uselessly, and his allies testify against him, and the woman he had tried to destroy become the strongest voice in the room. He thought of his wife in Boston, his children who barely knew him, the mind that was supposed to make everything worthwhile. He knew how this was going to end. He just could not stop it. Judge Callahan delivered his ruling with the efficiency of a man who had seen enough. Drummond Mining Company ordered to compensate all affected ranchers for loss of livestock. Mining operations suspended immediately pending full environmental review. Silas Drummond personally charged with conspiracy to commit arson and destruction of property, to be held in the Laramie County Jail pending trial before the territorial court. Virgil Crenshaw to serve his sentence for arson and assault at the Wyoming Territorial Prison in Laramie. The gavel came down. It was over. Outside the town hall, Eleanor stood in the street holding a letter that had been waiting for her at the post office. The journal had reached Whitfield's attorney. A new hearing had been granted. Whitfield's case would be reopened. She read the letter standing in the thin winter sunlight with people passing around her, their breath making clouds in the cold air. Her hands did not shake. Her eyes filled, but the tears did not fall. Caleb came up beside her. He took her hand. In full view of the entire town, in full view of Porter and Henderson and Thompson, and every person who had whispered and doubted and judged, nobody commented, nobody dared. They walked toward the wagon in silence, the kind of silence that does not need filling, the kind that exists between two people who have been through fire together and come out the other side still standing. "It is over," Eleanor said. Caleb shook his head. "No, it is just starting." 6 months after the trial, Eleanor stood on the hill where Margaret Hartman was buried and spoke to the woman she had never met. It was September of 1887. The wildflowers were thick on the hillside, blue and yellow and white, bending in a warm wind that carried the smell of grass and pine. The simple wooden cross had weathered to silver gray, and the pine tree that Margaret had loved, the one she said reminded her of her childhood in Ohio, cast a long shadow in the afternoon light. Eleanor placed a handful of wildflowers at the base of the cross. She stood there for a moment, her head bowed, her left shoulder aching the way it always did now. The collarbone had healed, but not perfectly. It probably never would. On cold mornings and before rainstorms, she felt it. A small, permanent reminder of the night the barn burned and she learned what she was willing to break for. "I will never replace you," Eleanor said quietly. "I would not try. But I want you to know that I am taking care of him, and the land, and the place where you rest. He is not the man he was when you left. He is harder in some ways, softer in others, but he is alive again. I think you would be glad of that." She stood for another moment, listening to the wind. Then she turned and found Caleb standing 10 feet behind her. He had come up the hill without sound, the way he moved through this land, with the instinctive quiet of a man who belonged to it. He had heard. He did not pretend he had not. He walked forward and stood beside her, looking down at the grave. When he spoke, his voice was rough. "I am sorry, Maggie, for choosing the ranch over you, for saying next week. I will not make that mistake again." Simple words. Quiet words. But they closed something that had been open and bleeding for 2 years, not healed. Wounds like that never fully heal. But closed. Sealed. Allowed, finally, to begin the long, slow process of becoming a scar instead of an open wound. They walked down the hill together. Caleb took Eleanor's hand. The ranch they returned to bore little resemblance to the dying place Eleanor had arrived at on Christmas Eve. They had renamed it Haven Ridge, and the name fit. 35 head of healthy cattle grazed the north pasture near the clean spring. A new barn stood where the old one had burned, built by the community over 3 weekends. Every family Eleanor had helped contributing a day of labor. The cabin had been repaired, the roof patched, the walls sealed, the sagging bed replaced with a proper frame that Caleb had built himself. Eleanor's clinic stood separate from the cabin now. A small building with a real examination table, shelves of medicines and remedies, and Dr. Whitfield's surgical instruments arranged with the reverence they deserved. A young man named Peter Mitchell, 18 years old and eager to learn, worked the ranch alongside Caleb, freeing Eleanor to devote more time to healing. The letter from Philadelphia had arrived in August. Eleanor had read it at the kitchen table with Caleb sitting across from her watching her face. Whitfield had been acquitted. The journal, combined with new testimony from a medical colleague who had reviewed the surgical notes, had been decisive. The court found that Whitfield had performed the surgery correctly, and that Edward Garrett Jr.'s death was the inevitable result of a condition too far advanced to treat. Whitfield had written a personal note at the bottom of the attorney's letter, in handwriting that Eleanor recognized with a pang that was equal parts joy and grief. "You saved me, Eleanor. Late, perhaps, but saved nonetheless. Knowledge does not die. You are proof of that. Go live your life. You have earned it." Eleanor folded the letter carefully. Put it in the wooden box that Caleb had carved for her, the one with wild flowers etched into the lid. And for the first time since Philadelphia, she felt the weight lift. Not partially, not temporarily, completely. The stone she had been carrying in her chest for 6 months dissolved, and in its place was something light and warm and free. She looked up at Caleb and smiled. He smiled back. Neither of them needed to say anything. Drummond Mining had shut down. The mine was closed, the equipment sold, the workers dispersed to other jobs in other towns. Drummond himself had been sentenced to 18 months in the county jail. He had sold his remaining assets, paid what restitution the court ordered, and disappeared from Wyoming as thoroughly as the snow disappeared in spring. No dramatic downfall, no final confrontation. He simply lost and left. The land he had poisoned would take years to recover, but the creek was already running cleaner, and the fish were coming back. Doc Harlan came to the clinic on a Tuesday morning in late September. He was sober. His hands were steady. His eyes were clear for the first time in years. "I want to learn from you," he said, "if you will have me." Eleanor looked at him. This man who had threatened her, allied against her, tried to destroy her. She saw the tremor that still lived in his fingers, the shame in his eyes, the stubborn flicker of the physician he had once been. She saw a man who had lost his way and was trying, clumsily and late, to find it again. "I will teach you everything I know," Eleanor said. "One condition. You stay sober. I will try. Do not try. Do it." "Do not?" He nodded once. Then he rolled up his sleeves, and they got to work. The wedding took place on the first Saturday of October. Judge Callahan officiated, looking mildly amused at being asked to formalize something the entire territory already considered settled fact. Samuel Porter and his wife stood as witnesses. The whole town attended. Eleanor wore white. The fabric had been a gift from Martha Henderson, who had cried while giving it, and who never again gossiped about Eleanor Shaw Hartman as long as she lived. Caleb wore a blue wool shirt that Eleanor had sewn from fabric she had bartered for in town, the color chosen because it matched his eyes. The vows were short. Neither Caleb nor Eleanor was given to lengthy declarations. But what they said was true. And in a story built on honesty, truth was the only currency that mattered. Caleb spoke first. "I do not promise to be perfect. I promise to be here, every morning, every hard day, every storm. I choose you. Not because I am desperate, but because I do not want to live another day without you beside me." Eleanor spoke next. "I have spent my whole life learning not to trust anyone. You made me unlearn it. I choose you. Not because I have nowhere else to go, but because there is nowhere else I want to be." The judge pronounced them married. Porter shook Caleb's hand. His wife kissed Eleanor's cheek. Thompson from the general store produced a bottle of good whiskey, and the community of Casper, Wyoming Territory, celebrated in the way frontier communities always celebrated, with food and drink and music and the particular warmth of people who have survived something together and know the value of what they have. The months that followed carried a sweetness that neither Caleb nor Eleanor had expected or believed they deserved. They moved through fall and into early winter with a new ease, the careful distance between them replaced by something natural and warm, small touches that became commonplace. A hand on the small of her back as they walked, her fingers brushing his arm when she passed him a tool. The way they fell asleep now, close together instead of on opposite sides of the bed, her head on his shoulder, his arm around her waist. It was not the passionate, consuming love of youth. It was something steadier and deeper. A love built on shared work and mutual respect, and the quiet understanding that comes from seeing someone at their worst and choosing to stay anyway. Christmas Eve came around again. 1 year since Eleanor had knocked on that door. 1 year since Caleb had opened it against every instinct and let in a half-frozen stranger with secrets in her bag and determination in her eyes. The snow was falling gently. Not a blizzard, not punishment. Just winter doing what winter does. The cabin was warm, the fire strong, dinner cooking on the stove. 2 place settings on the table that had once been covered in dust and unopened mail. And beside the table, tucked into the corner where the light from the fire could reach it, sat a small wooden cradle, not occupied yet. But there, waiting. Eleanor had not said anything directly. She did not need to. The cradle was enough. Caleb had built it himself. From pine wood he had cut and planed and sanded until it was smooth as glass. He had started it in November, working on it in the barn when Eleanor was busy at the clinic, and he had placed it beside the table without explanation. Eleanor had seen it, touched the smooth rim with her fingertips, and looked at him with eyes that said everything words could not. The knock came at sunset. 3 sharp raps on the cabin door. The same number, the same rhythm. 1 year later. Caleb stood up from the table. He looked at Eleanor, and a smile crossed his face. Not the guarded, cautious expression he had worn for most of the year, a real smile, full and warm and completely at ease. He walked to the door. This time he did not reach for the rifle. He opened it wide. Samuel Porter stood on the porch. Behind him, Martha Henderson. Behind her, the Dawson family, the Walkers, the Morrisons, the mill workers and their families. A dozen families, maybe more, carrying lanterns and baskets of food and wrapped packages, and the sound of laughter and Christmas carols sung off-key in the cold night air. "We could not let Christmas pass without celebrating together," Mrs. Henderson called out. "Not after everything you two have done for this community." More wagons appeared behind them, more lanterns, more voices. Within an hour, Haven Ridge was filled with people, neighbors who had become friends, patients who had become family. The community that Eleanor had built, one healed animal and one treated child at a time, coming together in the place that had become their gathering point, their refuge, their haven. Eleanor moved through the crowd with a grace that Caleb never tired of watching. She held Porter's daughter Lucy on her hip, the little girl healthy and chattering. She discussed a difficult case with Doc Harlan, who was 3 months sober and holding steady. She accepted thanks and well wishes and small gifts with the same quiet dignity she brought to everything. Caleb watched her from across the room. This woman who had walked 18 miles through a blizzard to reach a man she had never met, who had saved his cattle, his ranch, his life, who had faced down threats and violence and her own crushing guilt, and come through it all with her spine straight and her hands steady. Later, after the last guests had gone home and the cabin was quiet, Caleb and Eleanor stood at the window. Snow was falling outside, gentle and steady, covering Haven Ridge in white. Inside, the fire burned low and warm, and the empty cradle waited in the corner. "Do you remember?" Eleanor said softly. "1 year ago. You almost did not open the door, I remember. Nearly the worst mistake of my life." "Nearly? The worst mistake was telling Margaret next week. Not opening the door would have been second." Eleanor leaned into him. "And now?" "Now I open every door. Because I learned that the things worth having are usually standing on the other side, half frozen and stubborn as hell." She laughed, that full, bright laugh that he would never get tired of hearing. The neighbors' lanterns had disappeared down the road, their light fading into the distance. The world outside was dark and white and silent. Inside, everything was warm. Caleb lingered at the window for one more moment. He looked out at the snow falling over the land that had nearly been taken, nearly been abandoned, nearly been lost. Margaret's land, Eleanor's land, his land, theirs. He looked back inside where Eleanor was banking the fire for the night, one hand resting on the back of the empty cradle, the firelight catching her face and turning it gold. He did not deserve this. He knew that. But Eleanor had taught him something Margaret never had the chance to, that deserving was not the point. Showing up was, staying was, choosing every single day to open the door. Outside, the snow kept falling, patient and steady, covering Haven Ridge like a promise that spring would come again. It always did. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.